The late American writer Gore Vidal declared once, "We are the United States of amnesia. We learn nothing because we remember nothing." And I have always worried that this was a true statement about the state of our nation and also about the state of religion. And yet I am always heartened during the annual observances of Memorial Day, the day when we honor those who have died in military service, that we do try very hard to break through our amnesia and remember who we are, what we have done, warts and all. We do try to take an inventory of how we got where we got. And so throughout the Memorial Day weekend, network and cable television will air a host of film and documentaries that recall and examine the things we have seen and experienced, some of the horrible things we have done in war, and some of the heroic things we've done to protect life. And it is not all pretty, but we remember, we look at it all, or at least we try. And whether intentional or not, and whether we want to do it or not, we are called to remember. But this call to remember is not just a civic notion that addresses us as citizens of a particular nation. No, as we read our text today, the call to remember is also, first and foremost, a divine invitation to the church and to the faithful to keep the story of our relationship with God alive throughout the generations. Unfortunately, if you look around and if you listen a little more closely, we discover that as a church and as the faithful, we may have forgotten the story we are supposed to be telling. And now, how do I know we've forgotten the story? Because when I talk to people about church today, what they describe to me looks nothing like the church that God intended the church to be. So when you ask people about church, they say, especially those who just don't like church or don't go, they say, you know what, church does not feel like a community. Church is too judgmental. Church is too cliquish and insidery. Church just feels like a waste of time, especially when I got to get to brunch. And church, people seem to care more about condemning other people than they care about doing justice. Oh, people really don't like church. And sometimes I have to say, yeah, I think you got it about right. And so when you hear people say this about church, some religious folk get defensive, but I find it hard to get defensive when people complain about church. Because the reasons these people are giving about why they hate church or why they don't like church, I think should be a wake-up call to us. I think when people complain or criticize church, it should be a wake-up call to us that we may have just stopped being the church that they need us to be. Maybe they're telling us that you have gotten too far away from what I think church ought to be, because it's amazing. People have some idea of what church should be, even the ones who don't come. And I don't think that is a mistake. For those who don't, I think they have some idea what church ought to be saying that they aren't getting it. And look, this is not me being unfair to other churches or anything, because I count myself in this. Maybe, just maybe, I'm not telling the story. Just maybe, all God's children has forgotten how to tell the story. And so perhaps we would do well to remember and reclaim what God may have intended when God formed us as God's people. You see, the church is a product of a history and a tradition. in which God actively and intentionally formed a community with which to be in covenant. That God, in all divine love and power, put God's self in an intentional relationship with God's people, such that we are to be reconciled always. Now, let me put this down to you like this. You've been in a relationship. It ain't pretty every day. In a relationship, sometimes you start getting real and you don't like what you see. In a relationship, you start saying, I don't even know why I'm with this person, or how could this person even be with me? I'm horrible. This, at its core, is exactly what God did. God, in all of our faults, flaws, and failures, says, I want to be with you. And then that means that if God is so desperate and so longing to be with us, then there must be something that we have to bring to the relationship. And so God, in God's wisdom, gave statutes and ordinances, the things that we call the Ten Commandments. Isn't it interesting? We don't talk about the Ten Commandments very often, do we? You know about them, but we don't talk about them very much. There are all these people clamoring to put them on the lawn of the city council or the courts, but we don't really talk about what these Ten Commandments. But this is the first thing God did. God said, "Okay, I'm in relationship with you. Here are the commandments." But I think we miss the story again. Why these commandments? When you look at the commandments, and I wish I could go through them. I wish we had time to go through them, but read them. Go back and look at the Ten Commandments. You know them, but go back. Because everything that they do, God is forming a church. God is forming a community with these commandments. And what they do is they start off by saying, love and worship God and God only. The first thing is to love and worship God and God only. And then it goes on. We get down to about maybe the fourth or fifth one. It starts saying, now that you know that you're supposed to love and worship God only, if you do that, then what will happen is you'll start to love your family. You'll start taking care of your family. You'll start doing what you need to protect them. You won't do anything to hurt them or disappoint them or tear them down. And then as you get further down in those commandments, it gets to the point now where it said, if you love and worship God and God only, and then you start loving your family in such a way that you protect and care for them, guess what? Then you'll start loving the community. And then you won't steal from your neighbor. You won't kill your neighbor. You won't lie on your neighbor. Look, God is forming us. God is forming us. Very, very, love God. Love your family. Love your neighbor. Everything the church is and is called to be begins with the love and worship of God. And then it trickles down to everything else we do. Are we telling that story? Do people know that that's the story we're living out when they come in here? That we love and worship God. That we love and worship, we love each other. That we love our neighbors. Do they know this? Is this what we're telling the world? And so, having received this gift of grace in the form of these 10 commandments, in our text today, Moses tells the people to remember. Remember what God has done. We were slaves in Egypt, and God brought us out with a mighty hand. You know what has happened. We were hungry in the wilderness, and God gave us food to eat. We had no place to lay our heads, and God provided. Remember, do not forget how God delivered. Do not forget the commandments. And more important, tell your children. Tell your children. Tell them what happened, and then tell them to love and worship God. Because one day, those children are going to wonder why we should follow these commandments. And you'll be able to tell them that because it makes us church. It makes us who we are. Moses declares to them to hear and to have as their command, there is only one God, and God is God. Let me put this way. The Bible is not your God. I want to hear another amen on that one. The Bible is not God. Your doctrine is not God. And that is who you worship. And then Moses goes on and say, and you shall love God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. Keep these words. Recite these words. Is this what we are reciting and telling the people who come to church? Is this the church that we built, the one that loves God? Is this the church? Are we telling people to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might? And here's how I know what happens when we forget. As we read the prophets, as we read the history of Israel, every time Israel forgets God, every time Israel forgets to love and worship God, they fall apart. Every time Israel forgets to be church, everything goes wrong. Every time Israel fails to abide by the statutes and ordinances of God, they fail to love their neighbors. They do not feed the hungry. They do not clothe the naked. They do not care for the widow or the orphan or the stranger. They do not tend to the beloved community or provide for the general welfare. Even many hundreds of years after Moses exhorted God's people to remember, Jesus in his own ministry remembers the story. The young lawyer comes to him and say, hey, Jesus, what is the greatest commandment? And hundreds of years, ages away from Moses, Jesus says, love God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus told the story. Jesus remembered why they were church. What are we telling? What are we telling? Church is becoming less present in the lives of people, less present in the lives of our culture, less present for all of those who are looking for meaning and community. And much of the unpopularity of the church has to do with people not experiencing the story. Oh, we have to ask ourselves, if someone walks through those doors, will they know? Will they know that we're all about loving God, loving and worshiping God, and loving our neighbor? Will they know? Perhaps the complaints we hear is God's way of telling us that we have forgotten, that we've fallen into amnesia. We've forgotten who we are. We've forgotten how to love. We've forgotten that God loved us first and calls us to love in return. The church is indeed in trouble. The church is in trouble. And everything is pointing that way. The more and more people choosing not to do it, more and more people having a harder time finding that community. It may be because we have made church less about love and worship and more about power and control. Uh-oh. Maybe, just maybe, church has become less about service and community that leads us to embrace our neighbors and more about doctrine and dogma that leads us to exclude our neighbors. Oh, you all are so quiet. Maybe I'm saying something wrong about the church, but I'm going to keep going. If the church in the minds of the people who are coming to us is not known for its love and worship of God alone, if we are not known for taking care of the community, if we are not known for preserving our relationship with God, It may be because we've forgotten to tell the world that God loves us so much that he will put up with us. That God is not shaken because we're not perfect. That it is in our imperfection that God is actually revealed. Oh, yes, yes. I don't like to say it, but there are a lot of people that I look up there and I have to say, oh my God, they are in the image of God. I have to accept it. Friday, I was walking down the street, and there were people who were just really behaving badly, and one of them even muttered and called me faggot, and and I said to myself in that moment, I was about, I have a quick tongue, I was about to say something back, and then it came to me, don't be so preoccupied with the damage that you fail to see the image. Don't be so preoccupied with the damage that all of us are walking around with that you fail to see the image of God in us. And so we have to tell the story. We have to say that God has committed God's self to us in covenant, and it is our responsibility to remember and tell the world. It is our responsibility to bear witness to it, not to get into all of the weeds and the details about how I'm going to divide myself from you this day. It is a sad reality that sometimes we know more about how the church feels about LGBTQ people than we know about how they feel about embracing God's beloved. We know more about some churches' politics than we know about their prayer life. We know a lot about how church boasts about their buildings and their coffee shops and their gyms than we know about how much they've raised to feed all those hungry people that are walking around their very fine building. We know more how a church feels about women and whether or not they should be ordained than we know about how they lift up all God's children to bear witness to God's grace and mercy in their life, no matter where they come from. Maybe we have become a church of amnesia. And we must heed Moses' call to remember, to place the story front and center always so that people will know who and whose we are. Oh, whatever the churches are saying, far too many people are not hearing the story of God's love and the covenant that God has made with us. What is the story we're telling all God's children? How are we bearing witness to people looking for meaning and for relationship? It may be worth going back to those 10 commandments to remember how to love and worship God again, how to promote the general welfare for every person, how to love our neighbors enough to build beloved community. And so in light of the decreasing interest in church, I believe we are invited to take another look at the church we've built. And it's okay to do so. Take a look at the church we built, the church we're building right now. Look at it. And place renewed emphasis on loving and worshiping God first and foremost. And then remember to tell the story of God's wondrous work in and through us.